Survival horror is in a weird, undefined place, and it has been for decades. If you hear that a game is survival horror, you'll more than likely assume it's like Dead Space, Silent Hill 2, or Resident Evil 4. However, survival horror is a wide spectrum of a genre. Survival horror could mean a game like Resident Evil 1, Outlast, or Resident Evil 4. Lots of different styles lie under this umbrella, and I'm here today to at least try to define and distinguish types of survival horror that have existed in this genre's lifespan. I think a good place to begin is to define what is and isn't survival horror to me, starting off with what isn't. Survival horror does not include all horror-themed games. Yes, I know if a game is horror-themed, the goal will probably be to survive the horror, hence survival horror, but I beg to differ. Horror-themed survival games are not survival horror. Wave-based survival like Call of Duty Zombies, Killing Floor, or even Left 4 Dead are just horror-themed survival games. Open-world survival craft games with horror themes like The Forest, 7 Days to Die, or I guess you could argue Subnautica, are also not survival horror. With how I've seen the term survival horror used, I don't think a portion of horror games actually fit into this genre. Horror being an atmospheric theme more than a gameplay-relevant genre makes it difficult to group games into subgenres based on gameplay. Some games don't fit enough into the genre categories that I perceive to be survival horror. The original Five Nights at Freddy's games, Dying Light, and Ghostwire Tokyo are horror games that don't fit the bill of being survival horror. And the last big determining factor to classify a horror game as not survival horror is the end goal of the game. Horror games that do not have a clear end goal or that are infinite do not count as survival horror in my eyes. Roguelikes, PvP multiplayer, ghost hunting, and non-campaign games, in an overwhelming majority of cases, are not survival horror. The Binding of Isaac, Dead by Daylight, Phasmophobia, and Repo are not survival horror. Looking at games that I've seen called survival horror, I came up with 3 categories to communicate what survival horror is to me. I like to call these waves, hence the video's title. These waves represent where the industry was for a period of time in terms of developing horror games. And also, if the game has a crank, it's probably survival horror. First wave survival horror games are admittedly my favorite as they truly represent surviving a horror. First wave games emphasize exploration as a means to progress and escape throughout the game. There are options to fight back against antagonistic forces, but there is a consideration for conserving your resources. First Wave has more emphasis on puzzles, exploration, and mastering the map. While First Wave does have ways of combating your adversaries, it tends to encourage a more resourceful approach. Good examples of First Wave are the first few Resident Evils, Tormented Souls, Crow Country, and one other series that I usually forget.
Silent Hill.
Oh, thanks, James. Second wave survival horror games are more focused on immersion and pure horror. Second wave games tend to be influenced more by stealth due to their complete lack of or minimal ways to fight back. Second wave games tend to be more linear than first wave games and have less backtracking. Second wave is based more on surviving a horror than survival mechanics. There's not much resource conservation because you can't do much against the threats in these games in the first place. Out of all of the waves of survival horror, second wave has the least action as they tend to encourage the "if it can see me, I'm dead" mindset. Good examples of second wave are most games that star one or more monsters following you as you progress throughout the game, like Alien Isolation and Slender, as well as series such as Outlast and Amnesia. I always forget that one. Third wave survival horror games are more action-oriented, but still hold on to some elements of survival horror. These games give you enough ways to take a violent approach through most encounters in the game, and often require you to clear out areas before you proceed. These games tend to have a fairly large overlap with linear action shooters like Uncharted, Gears of War, and even Call of Duty. I don't really consider third wave games to be survival horror unless if they have more oomph than just horror themes. Some games that I still consider third wave survival horror are Resident Evil 4 through 6, The Last of Us, BioShock, somewhat, Metro, and sorry, my memory's terrible.
Evil Within, too.
Thanks, Sebastian. What would I do without you? First wave survival horror games are, as you could have guessed, the first games to be labeled as survival horror. The genre originated as most older games did, with awkward camera angles and clunky controls by today's standards. First wave's strongest defining feature is its emphasis on exploration and puzzles. First wave games are just like escape rooms, except on a significantly larger scale. Think escape mansions. The original Resident Evil quite literally takes place in an escape mansion. In order to progress, you need to find what items go where and solve puzzles to open up more of the map. Progression in first wave games feels exponential with how the map opens up. The game flow that accompanies first wave games is something that encourages mastery and knowledge of the map. Key items open up more of the map, which unlocks new key items, which unlock more of the map. You get the idea.
Exit RPD, he needs to open the garage gate, which requires the parking pass key card, which he needs the second box electronic part to get. That electronic part is located in the clock tower, but to get to the clock tower, you have to move all the shelves in the library to make a bridge. And with the shelves, you need to jackhandle, which is in the records room in the first floor of the west wing, which is where he's headed now since the club key opens that door.
Subsequent playthroughs of first wave games will likely be quicker due to knowing the route through the escape mansion, and mastery comes from perfecting that route. If a first wave game takes you 10 hours to beat the first time, it can take you 3 hours to beat when trying to go fast. You could argue that this defeats the purpose of the game, but how else are you supposed to replay it if you already know all of the puzzle solutions and steps to reach the end? Aside from these games being more tailored to exploration, there's also some other features that appear often, but not universally, in games that I define as first wave. If the game has weapons or tools to fight back, which is almost always the case, ammo and the ability to use these weapons will be regulated. It can be a better option to avoid combat and weave through enemies in these games, avoiding hits and not using up precious resources. Weaving through enemies, or as I like to call it, reveling, is a rewarding part of the first wave experience. Although it's a thing survival horror games have started to stray away from, item boxes and inventory management are a big part of first wave's origins. Keeping track of what you need and only having limited space to do so makes gameplay a bit more intentional. Obviously, this comes at a large cost when the need for backtracking is enhanced and picking up everything you see is punished. I have a love-hate relationship with item boxes and inventory management as a whole. Maintaining item boxes can be tedious with smaller inventories, but never having to worry about key items can streamline these games nearly too much. Limited saves are not only a fading mechanic for the genre, but they also encourage a more intentional playstyle. I really like limited saves as a gameplay mechanic. It encourages being careful at the cost of the nearly tangible risk of wasted time. In a way, this mechanic really feeds into the fear of these games. Having a real fear of losing real progress encourages you to save, and if the saves are limited, it enhances this experience. Knowing what you did wrong when retrying an area feels good when you can use any information you discovered from your previous life. Limited saves do come with an obvious downside though. First off, not everybody likes them. Some people are understandably more save happy and hate losing progress in any regard. Limited saves, being, well, limited, makes it so that some players who struggle to use consumables will save them up and may have to backtrack further because of their habits. If limited saves are done in a game, their amount matters. If saves are too plentiful, it seems like a pointless mechanic. If saves are too limited, the game may be too punishing in that regard. The last notable commonality between many first wave games is an isometric camera, or at least a layout that promotes said camera. Not all first wave games need an isometric camera angle or even tank controls, but it is a reoccurring visual element in many games that are, or at least try to follow, first wave's influence on survival horror. Isometric camera angles can make survival horror games more immersive on the horror side by limiting player agency while also temporarily obstructing some assets' existence. Resident Evil 1 has some great use of these isometric camera angles. Resident Evil 1 was also my first wave survival horror game, and it set the bar high. Progression felt amazing, the game looked visually stunning for its time, and still does, and the controls were clunky, but something I enjoyed mastering. The door animations, which I did a tier list on because I'm insane, are one of the weaker points of the game for some, but I didn't mind them. During the door animations, I had time to mentally figure out where I was going and what directions I would turn with tank controls. I made the best use of my time that I could, and this felt rewarding as I could traverse the map with ease due to the amount of time I spent deliberately thinking about my route. The progression in Resident Evil 1 is really good. You find out where you need to go by exploring, and as you collect key items, you realize how the map just makes sense as progression snowballs. Your inventory space is limited, so you have to make decisions on if you want to bring powerful weapons or keep more space to be able to progress. Going for straight progression can be risky, but taking extra protection slows progression. You can't always carry your cranks with you. Resident Evil 0 is the prequel to Resident Evil 1, obviously, and although it has its flaws and, let's say, unique execution, I still think it's a great game. Resident Evil 0 does not have an item box or a unique key item inventory. Instead, you leave your items on the floor to make room for everything else. In Resident Evil 0, you organize everything on the floor, but the map can help you locate items that you left behind this way. Resident Evil 0 also stands out in the fact where you control two characters at once. Inventory space is doubled, but at numerous points in the game, you have to solve puzzles or progress through areas with half of your inventory and combat capabilities. If we're comparing RE1 with RE0, I think RE1 is a better game with a less impactful story. Possibly hot take, I do think RE0 has one of the better Resident Evil stories, but that's beside the point. Unfortunately, the Silent Hill 2 remake is the only Silent Hill game I've played so far. However, I genuinely enjoyed it and hope to play more at some point in the future. Silent Hill 2 might be the best execution of a first-wave survival horror game I've seen by a AAA studio in years. Its combat is slow and mostly optional. Its puzzles are of a decent quality, its atmosphere is unmatched, if you can get over the potential low performance, and I genuinely enjoyed the game's pacing. The story, themes, and the existence and execution of the alternative endings put the cherry on top for a great game that I will recommend despite not being able to say much about it without spoilers. In terms of non-AAA first-wave games, Crow Country and Tormented Souls are really good. So good in fact that they both might get their own video sometime soon on this channel. Crow Country feels like a Resident Evil Lite. It gave me the same satisfaction of Resident Evil 1, but on a much smaller scale. With the benefit of coming out 28 years after Resident Evil, Crow Country streamlines a classic Resident Evil experience to modern gaming. The camera is at an isometric angle that the genre was founded upon, but can be rotated easily. Tank controls are an option, but also don't need to be used. You see, you can use tank controls on the D-pad and free movement controls on the analog stick, all at your own whim. On top of that, with how the free cam works in the game, you don't run into issues that can happen with free move and isometric cameras, like running back and forth when the camera changes. Crow Country also benefits from no item boxes and no limited saves. You have a max inventory limit for resources, and save rooms are far apart. Progression feels very natural as the map opens up, the story is interesting, and the game is replayable, offering rewards based on game completion, which is something classic Resident Evils do well. Tormented Souls follows the Resident Evil formula, slightly stricter than Crow Country, with harsher limited saves and exclusive tank controls, but I don't think either of these ruined the game. Tormented Souls possibly has the best puzzles I have seen in any game. They ride the fine line between "that was a dumb solution, how could I ever have gotten that without help," and "the puzzle just told me the answer." Nearly every puzzle in Tormented Souls is answered with internal knowledge to the game, and their difficulty is super rewarding. The other challenge in Tormented Souls is save and weapon management. The game feels slightly too punishing with saves early on. I felt like I was low on ammo, even with ignoring most enemies like I naturally do. Dodging and baiting enemies is rewarding, but I think it's more required to save ammo when compared to the other first wave games I've played. I have more games to list that apply to first wave, but they fall into a sort of multi-wave survival horror hybrid. Yes, I will talk about Resident Evil 2 later, but for the time being, I think we need a change of pace, and a good place to start is with second wave. Second wave survival horror is a genre about stealth and being stalked. While first wave more commonly covers the horror of escaping an unknown place, second wave explores the horror of escaping a specific threat. Stealth is extremely common in Second Wave, as you'll see in the future examples, and this is further exemplified by the often lacking offensive capabilities given to the player. Second Wave games tend to be fairly linear, and their campaigns focus more on linear escape segments. Backtracking and exploration are less common in these games, as their main focus revolves around guiding the player through more streamlined and focused areas. Remember, these games are more about escaping something than escaping some place. Due to these games' linear execution, lots of atmosphere goes into specific areas and set pieces. You will be in specific areas for a while, but you won't really be able to backtrack too far in these games due to their structure and narrative path. If you want to escape something hunting you, why would you turn back? A commonality between most Second Wave games are scripted chase sequences. At various points in the game, you may run directly into the antagonist, and due to not having offensive capabilities, you need to run. While a good way of creating tension in the moment, execution of these scripted segments can vary. These only serve as a way to make the player tense at the fear of having to replay a portion of the game. Restarting from a checkpoint more or less ruins the atmosphere of a chase sequence to begin with. A lot of horror from Second Wave games comes from fear of dying and having to redo parts of the game. Chase sequences, despite their popularity, don't really mix well with the formula. Having a chase segment be too difficult increases tension, but increases the chance that it must be replayed and potentially worsens the experience of the game. If a chase segment is too trivial, then its existence is questionable due to it not actually raising tension. Second Wave survival horror games usually rely on stealth as a gameplay mechanic. One of the best ways to make players engage with stealth mechanics is to increase the stakes so that stealth feels nearly required. The most common way to do this is to make the player health pools smaller and enemies stronger. One-shots are extremely common in Second Wave survival horror, and stealthing around enemies is almost a requirement for most of these games. A lot of survival horror in Second Wave games is the inability to fight back, so making the enemies dangerous enough to one-shot you is true to the game's design. Escaping a threat feels rewarding, so why not make the threat more threatening by giving them a one-shot? Thematically, Second Wave horror games tend to have a strong antagonist and are often based around them. Having a specific thing hunt you down throughout the game is a semi-consistent part of Second Wave games. Slenderman in Slender 8 Pages, Alien in Alien Isolation, and the Beast in Amnesia all have different behaviors, but are still strong threats for their respective games. Stalker enemies, while not exclusive to Second Wave, are a mechanic that I feel are heavily inspired from Second Wave and its design. Stalker enemies are an unpredictable threat that roam freely around the map and halt progression due to forcing a non-scripted fight, flight, or hide response from the player. Some games make a decent case for being Second Wave despite having less danger than their contemporaries. To some, Second Wave games that have a lower level of threat could be considered walking sims. I think that some games I do end up listing have a significant overlap with walking sims, and I wouldn't be too opposed to calling them survival horror walking sims. Amnesia: The Dark Descent is a really solid example of Second Wave survival horror, and is one of the original Second Wave games, which can explain some of its First Wave influences in regards to exploring and collecting items. Amnesia is one of the more unique Second Wave games I've played for this video, as it has a sanity mechanic. Sanity in Amnesia decays when you're in the dark, and makes the game much harder to see and play. You can work around the darkness by using your fuel-limited lantern, or by using consumable tinder boxes to light candles. Amnesia's roaming threat appears seemingly at random throughout the game, and when you aren't managing your sanity in the darkness, you need to keep an eye out for the beast to hide from. Amnesia has a bit more puzzle and open design than other Second Wave games, but progression is still linear, unlike the typical First Wave games. Outlast is probably the single best example for a Second Wave game. It's incredibly linear, with different distinct sections. Most of the gameplay is either hiding around the big bads or running from them. The scares and atmosphere are well done, and there's no form of defense that the player has access to. A lot of my enjoyment from Outlast came from the world and understanding the story through the logs in the game. The gameplay was tense, but some sections tested my patience more than immersed me. Outlast represents Second Wave well, warts and all. Kholat is a lesser-known game where you explore the Ural Mountains after the events of the Dyatlov Pass incident. In Kholat, your goal is to collect pages scattered throughout the map and to explore Dyatlov Pass. The twist? There's a spirit that appears in some areas, and the only way to navigate is with a map and a compass. The map has different locations marked with latitude and longitude, and it's up to you to find out where you are and where you need to go, with no live updating map markers. I really enjoyed how navigation was implemented in Kholat, and how exploration felt realistic without being frustrating for my taste at least. Kholat is a solid game that I think is overhated when looking at the Steam reviews. The game does really well in the world building department, and its world is honestly mysterious enough to be engaging. If you do end up trying out Kholat, be warned that the game only saves when you pick up a text entry, which can lead to some frustrating moments of backtracking. Slender 8 Pages is another game about collecting pages in the wilderness while being hunted by an unknown entity. Slender is kind of a curveball in terms of categorization. It kind of feels weird calling it second wave survival horror, but at the same time it fits many parts of the mold that makes second wave games second wave. Slender has a strong atmosphere where every odd number of pages collected, the ambient audio and music ramps up, building to a nearly palpable amount of tension. Resources are limited in forms of sprint and the flashlight, where overusing the flashlight makes its light significantly weaker. Progression is relatively linear in regards to your goals, and the gameplay is built around getting away from a threat while also trying to progress. Slender could very much be considered second wave if it followed a typical story instead of being run-based, but here it lies in this weird survival horror limbo. Made of Scare is another lesser-known second wave survival horror game. Out of all games in this section, Made of Scare is most similar to First Wave in terms of mapping. The map is fully explorable with very little points of no return or areas that are blocked off after you explore them. Even though the map has a more open design, backtracking is not necessary and puzzles are basically non-existent. There's no real way to fight the enemies, and your main ways of dealing with threats are stealth and evasion. For a point during the game, you unlock a consumable that will allow you to stun enemies, but these are limited and don't even clear enemies off the map. They're just there to help you out in a pinch. I found Made of Scare to be a decent game, and I'd recommend it for a less punishing and more exploration-heavy second wave game. The Beast Inside is the last of the pure second wave games that I'll bring up. The Beast Inside is separated into chapters, half of which take place as different characters in different eras with different atmospheres. Half of The Beast Inside is walking to where you need to go during the daytime, and the other half is, well, the same thing, but the nighttime. There are some good scares, particularly during the first part of the game in the night section, and the atmosphere is well done even during the daytime. The story is interesting due to its twists and turns, but largely I didn't really enjoy the game. This is mostly from the game having too large of an emphasis on its non-lethal daytime exploration segments. Second wave survival horror games are more about the experience of being hunted and trying to escape something without the means to fight back. Third wave games are the opposite in many ways. Third wave survival horror games are developed with directly fighting back against threats in mind. Third wave games are the modernized and simplified equivalent of survival horror. They are what survival horror has evolved into, or some, me included, might say devolved into. More action-heavy survival horror games will tend to fit the mold of third wave than anything else in the horror genre. I personally don't think many of the games in this section are actually survival horror, but I feel like it's a semi-common consensus to categorize these games as such. These more action-oriented games have horror themes, enemies, and atmospheric choices, but not all of these games have typical survival mechanics, mainly the need to manage your resources. I found that these games don't balance out inventory management that well. I even made a whole video over 2 years ago about how the original Resident Evil 4 was not really survival horror, and one of its worst offenses was how ammo dropped so frequently, even from unarmed enemies. If a survival horror game doesn't really let you feel like you have to conserve resources, is it really a survival game? The horror from a lot of horror-themed video games comes from not only the environment, atmosphere, and themes, but also the tension from threats. In games where the enemies are bullet fodder and non-threatening, a lot of potential horror wears off. In Call of Duty, you aren't afraid of the people shooting at you, you're more so afraid of restarting from a checkpoint. In my opinion, a lot of third-wave games have a significant overlap with this feeling from Call of Duty. No matter how well the atmosphere is done, if I have plenty of ammo and am able to throw it at weak enemies without a care in the world, I won't feel that tense. If a survival horror game allows you to easily obliterate everything in your way, is it really a horror game? Most third-wave survival horror games that I've played focus on combat encounters that require eliminating all enemies in an area to progress. This makes stealth an unreasonable and impossible task. This is counterintuitive to pre-third-wave survival horror's design, where combat is a decision the player makes to use resources, or something that can simply be avoided with the right pathing. Requiring the player to waste their resources to be released from an area is something that doesn't fit in earlier iterations of survival horror. Of course, this excludes any boss encounters. Third-wave survival horror games are often extremely linear, and they either lack puzzles or their puzzles are too streamlined and simplified. Puzzles in third-wave games are a lesser feature due to them potentially taking away from the action vibe of these games. Puzzles don't really fit in this modernization of survival horror due to how they can break the pace and, in cases, make the game come to a grinding halt. As you could have probably pieced together, third-wave survival horror is something I struggle with genuinely calling survival horror. But with how often these games are considered survival horror, or even a modern evolution of it, I unfortunately feel inclined to do the same. If I were to propose an alternative naming scheme instead of third-wave, I'd just call these games action horror for obvious reasons. Describing these games as survival horror can be detrimental to players' experiences who want a more classic survival horror experience. Some of the games in this next section are games that I came into with the wrong mindset and assumed they'd be more true to survival horror and its roots. I do think many of these games are good games, and I can recommend each in their own regard, as long as you keep your survival horror expectations in check and just think of these games as horror-themed action games rather than the typical survival horror experience. Resident Evil 4 was one of the first games to pivot survival horror into a more action-oriented genre. Resident Evil 4 is not just one of the most influential horror games, but I'd argue it's extremely influential to gaming as a whole. Most third-person action-adventure games stem from Resident Evil 4 in some way. Developers from both Uncharted and Gears of War have credited Resident Evil 4 as influential, and I'd argue that we wouldn't really have a lot of games today without RE4's influence. And I'm gonna get crucified for saying this, but survival horror as a specific genre niche was ruined by Resident Evil 4. It took several years for Resident Evil to somewhat come back to its roots, and we're not even fully there. Maybe Requiem will bring us closer to that, but I don't know. I've been avoiding any Requiem information like the plague. Tangent aside, Resident Evil 4 is a solid action game with a decent atmosphere, a ton of replayability if you're into it, and a pretty scary section that I'm sure gave some kids PTSD back in 2004. If you want to experience the granddaddy of third-person action games, you can play the original, and if you want a more modern and streamlined take on the game, the remake is really well done. Again, I have already done a video on Resident Evil 4 that does a bit more justice than this one. So if you want to know more, check out that video or just play it for yourself. Resident Evil 5 is understandably a lot of people's guilty pleasures. It's a fun co-op experience that helps establish the Resident Evil universe more, and in a way is a send-off to part of the Resident Evil timeline. As a solo experience, I found Resident Evil 5 to be aggravating. Inventory management was not built with solo play in mind, as the game pairs you with an AI that makes everything so much more tedious. If you play RE5, please play it in co-op and spare yourself that struggle. In terms of gameplay, RE5 is alright. The shooting is decent, the movement is a bit clunky, and the game is fun when you turn off your brain just to shoot things and push forward. Resident Evil 6 also has co-op, but this time the game feels okay even in solo. RE6 is known as the series' temporary departure from its horror roots. Barely any of RE6 feels like horror. I mean, the same can be said for RE5, but at least 5 tried with one of its DLC campaigns. Resident Evil 6 is a long game, but the movement and hectic gameplay makes it at least stand out as a unique Resident Evil game that some people still enjoy for what it is. The Evil Within series is if the action trilogy of Resident Evil were more horror-based, with solid creature designs and some psychological horror elements. The Evil Within is action-oriented with weapon upgrades and the like, but I think the atmosphere in the series is some of the best atmosphere we've had across third-wave survival horror, especially during that era of games. There are also often encounters that completely overpower the player and actually make the experience, in a way, feel like you are surviving a horror. If you liked Resident Evil 4 through 6 and want a more horror-themed game, I would recommend the Evil Within series. Probably recommend it in general because I really enjoyed my experience with these games in the past. The first game is a bit clunkier, but it still holds up. The Last of Us is another example of third-wave survival horror. Unfortunately, it's been over a decade ago since I played it, so I can't say much about it. From what I do remember, its horror and atmosphere were really well done, and its story deserves the praise that it got. Again, unfortunately, I don't think I can accurately cover the game, so I can't officially recommend it, but hey, it might be really good. The last of the pure third-wave games I have for you today is Metro 2033 and presumably the whole Metro series. Unfortunately, I have only played 2033 Redux, but from what I can tell, Metro is a good action-oriented first-person shooter with survival mechanics like limited resources and a good post-apocalyptic horror-themed story. If you go into Metro expecting a classic survival horror experience, ease your expectations a little. On the modes that I played on, I thought I would get a true survival horror experience, but instead I got Russian Call of Duty on veteran difficulty with less ammo. Metro is a prime example of why we need to distinguish third-wave survival horror from first and second. If Metro wasn't marketed as survival horror, then I would have expected the game to play out differently. But with how things were, I just ended up being frustrated with the game because it felt like it was trying to be dishonest with me. True survival horror doesn't throw fast-paced action at you where hitting every shot in a tight time window is crucial. Let's take a small break from talking about survival horror, maybe drink some water, and also talk about some specific examples of what doesn't fit in the genre. Limbo and Inside, while great atmospheric indie titles that I will recommend, do not fit into any of the survival horror subgenres. If anything, these games are horror puzzle platformers, which is a unique mix of genres. The closest that these games get to survival horror is second wave due to you playing a defenseless child, but there's little to no stealth and they just don't feel like second wave enough. But I can see where people could consider it. Five Nights at Freddy's, at least the original games, are definitely not survival horror by my standards. There are resource management mechanics, but that's it. The game design of Five Nights at Freddy's is extremely atypical, and I think lumping it in with the whole genre of survival horror does its uniqueness a disservice. What genre would I call it? I don't know, I'm making that someone else's problem. But if I were to just throw out a name, maybe I'd say a security simulator? Ghostwire Tokyo is another unique game that I can at least describe the genre of. It's an open-world power shooter with horror themes. I wouldn't call Ghostwire Tokyo a third-wave game due to its unique gameplay, traversal mechanics, and open-world nature. There are no real survival influences in gameplay other than consumable health items, which are fairly difficult to get rid of completely. For many of the same reasons, I can say that Dying Light is also not survival horror. It's an open-world parkour game with zombies and some horror elements like night gameplay and well-done creature design. I still need to play further through Dying Light, but I am excited for when I do eventually get to it. All the games I've played that I haven't yet mentioned fit into this section of hybrid games. I think many great survival horror games don't clearly fit into one of the aforementioned three categories and are a combination of them or have enough influence outside of the survival horror sphere, but still have enough survival horror DNA for me to still classify them here. Clock Tower is a game that predates the original Resident Evil, and can be described as a point-and-click horror escape room adventure. Clock Tower's environment and atmosphere is similar to the original Resident Evil. You're trapped in a mansion and must escape using various tools at your disposal. As you move throughout the map, you get more tools that can help you progress and possibly evade the threats pursuing you. Clock Tower has the exploration and pacing of First Wave, while its limited defensive capabilities and stalker enemies make Clock Tower feel a bit second wavy. I'd recommend Clock Tower if you want an older style puzzle game with some fairly retro mechanics. Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil Revelations 1 and 2 are strong First Wave games with a bit of Third Wave sprinkled in. Resident Evil 2 is a really well done remake, and I feel like it's a solid First Wave game. The only reason I think it's a little third wavy is because its combat is a little too streamlined. Shooting through most everything is a valid option in Resident Evil 2, while evasion and ammo conservation aren't as necessary as other First Wave games. I can wholeheartedly recommend playing Resident Evil 2 if you're even slightly interested in playing anything survival horror. It deserves its praise. I think the Revelation games are underrated, and I have a whole video talking about Revelations 1, so I'll keep their information brief. I think the Revelation games are a good example of games that are equally first and third wave in their execution. Revelations 2 loses out on some exploration due to its linear nature, but both are enjoyable, especially at their low prices on discount. Little Nightmares is a pretty unique game that I think is difficult to fully label as survival horror. If I were to describe Little Nightmares, it would be a second wave game due to its stealth elements and scripted chase sequences. The reason I feel uncertain about calling it survival horror is that there are no survival mechanics. There's no resources to manage, and checkpoints are frequent enough that each encounter feels like a puzzle instead of a typical survival horror stealth segment. If you liked Limbo, or want a more low-key second wave experience that's not as immersive due to the locked camera, I'd recommend Little Nightmares or any of its sequels. Resident Evil 7 has a special place in my heart as one of the first survival horror games I truly enjoyed. I also made my first video essay on it. It's a little outdated, but a lot of my opinions still stand. RE7 is a solid example of a first and second wave hybrid. The first sections of the game, you're weak, and progression is very akin to an escape room. There are some puzzles, but their difficulty is trivial, and ammo feels like it's just the right amount of limited. Resident Evil 7 has a really solid atmosphere, and I think it's a strong example of modern first wave games and what AAA studios can do with a solid focus and budget. Again, not knowing much about Requiem, I have high hopes for it to be similar to RE7 or RE2, modern but still classically inspired. Alien Isolation is a lot of people's horror goats, and understandably. The AI has so much deserved praise, and the atmosphere and fear is palpable. Before I replayed Alien Isolation, I thought it would be more true to Second Wave with its focus on the titular alien and the inability to really do any harm to the apex predator. While I still think Alien Isolation represents Second Wave best, you can make a strong case for the game having an exploration focus with mapping and progression like other First Wave titles. The first half of Alien feels more open and less streamlined than typical Second Wave games. Also, you can fight back against other threats earlier in the game, so I think the compromise is understandable. Soma is a philosophical and psychological horror game that often feels like a walking sim in terms of gameplay. I did not mind the lacking gameplay in Soma due to a strong narrative, themes, atmosphere, and storytelling. Soma is largely a game where you don't have to worry about surviving, and it's more so based on progressing through different regions of the game while taking in the story. There are limited occasions where you need to stealth around, but they do exist. I'd recommend playing through Soma if you want an experience instead of a game to play, as cheesy as that sounds. I'd put Soma in the second wave survival horror category for obvious reasons, but I think it only barely fits there. The Resident Evil 3 remake has its share of problems when it's compared to the original. However, I think Resident Evil 3 is a great example of a hybrid between first and third wave survival horror. While RE3 is linear, it has portions of level design that are reminiscent of first wave games like The City, Hospital, and the Clock Tower. Oh, sorry, wrong version. I think Resident Evil 3 Remake has a much stronger influence from third wave survival horror. The game is a lot more oriented around doing damage and outkilling your enemies, rather than surviving and struggling for resources. Resident Evil 8 is a game that does a lot. There are many sections throughout the game that vary in atmosphere, ways to progress, and ways to combat your adversaries, if any. The first and penultimate sections of the game represent first wave survival horror with their exploration focus. One section in the middle very much resembles second wave, with how the game limits you and puts you in an atmospheric area requiring stealth or you'll be one-shot. And the other parts of the game represent third wave with their action-oriented gameplay. Resident Evil 8 is a game that does it all, but doesn't commit to doing anything super strongly. I liked RE8, but it wasn't that impactful to me. Daymare 1998 is similar to the Resident Evil 2 remake, but a bit clunkier, less optimized, and slightly more action-focused. Where Resident Evil 2 was a first wave with some hints of third wave gameplay, Daymare is a first wave with about an equal or greater amount of third wave. It's been a while since I played through it, but I remember a lesser focus on exploration than in other survival horror games. Daymare is divided into chapters with different playable characters, and the pacing feels like games more akin to third wave. If you really like the Resident Evil 2 remake, you may just possibly like Daymare. But don't say I didn't warn you, it's definitely not one of my favorite games I've mentioned. BioShock is one of the greats in gaming, and with trepidation, I'm willing to call it survival horror, or at least inspired by it. Now, to clarify, I don't actually think BioShock is purely survival horror. It's a power shooter with a strong atmosphere and some survival mechanics, although the survival mechanics are a bit more low-key, like health, pretty generous ammo, and Eve. If people consider Resident Evil 4 and Metro 2033 survival horror, why shouldn't BioShock be considered it as well? BioShock is a game that I will always recommend when given the opportunity. Any game in this series is worthy of being someone's favorite game for the atmosphere, story, lore, gameplay, characters, or any combination of these. We are almost done, and we're ending on another potential hot take. Prey 2017 is justified in being called a survival horror game. Prey has limited inventory, the necessity to conserve weapons and ammo, avoidable enemies, a horror theme, and a focus on combat with powers and abilities enabling it. Prey has a fairly open map that encourages exploration and even experimentation given the game's nature, which makes me feel a little justified in saying that parts of Prey can feel similar to first wave games. The primary focus and means to harm enemies makes me view Prey as a third wave survival horror game if I were to categorize it. Prey was an interesting immersive sim that I unfortunately did not feel I got full value out of for my first playthrough. I'd recommend Prey if you enjoy a more creative spin on shooters or just want a Lovecraftian-esque space horror game, which definitely sounds right up some people's alley. I want to end with a brief overview and recap of what I think distinguishes the categories of survival horror for one final time. I want these ideas to be cemented in your minds, and I want you to think about horror games that you play and, at least mentally, try and categorize them. Maybe at some point in the future this catches on, and we can help the game making, marketing, and playing process easier for the currently expansive genre that survival horror is. First wave survival horror is the subgenre that focuses on making the player explore and master the layout of an area to escape. Resident Evil 1 is a solid example of a pure first wave game. The maps in first wave games tend to be more open in terms of exploration, while also being tight. There isn't usually much room in rooms. Difficulty comes from limited resources and, depending on the game, clunky mechanics. Often these games have a sort of fixed camera. First wave games implement a lower amount of resources, so the player does struggle for them. And when this is balanced correctly, resource hoarding becomes less natural. First wave games tend to not be as beginner friendly, and if someone is not expecting an exploration or puzzle emphasized game, they may get a bad first impression. The deprecating way you can describe first wave games is a slightly more gameplay oriented point and click game.
Now you have to understand, this is not a zombie shooting game. The original Resident Evil is more of a point-and-click puzzle game where you are supposed to walk around the zombies.
Second wave survival horror is focused on the scare and surviving against unstoppable threats. Outlast is a solid example of a pure second wave game. Enemies usually aren't killable and are often treated as an unstoppable adversary that requires evasion to counter. You could equate a lot of Second Wave's design to stealth and encouragement towards trepidatious gameplay. They tend to be done in a first-person camera. Second Wave games can be a bit boring if you want something with more gameplay, but can be engaging if you want to play a non-mechanically stressful game. Second Wave games will often have means for the player to get one shot to, in a way, enhance the horror of the game, so that is something to be wary of. The deprecating way you can describe second wave games is horror-themed walking sims with stealth mechanics. Third wave survival horror is kind of a generalized genre. Resident Evil 4 is a solid example of a pure third wave game. Basically, if the game has a through line of a horror theme but is action-centric, it is very likely to be a third wave game. Of course, the game would need to still follow a story with a definitive end goal to even qualify. Most AAA games that are marketed as survival horror are usually third-wave survival horror. These games, due to their focus on action, will usually give the player fully auto weapons early on in the game, removing a significant portion of tension from combat. I personally don't feel like most third-wave games really earn the title of the genre, but I'm willing to make an exception as long as they stay separate from first wave and don't completely overshadow it. Of course, the deprecating way you can describe a third wave game is a mindless action shooter with some horror, I guess. This video marks my temporary retirement from the survival horror genre. It has been an absolutely wild ride, finishing over 25 survival horror games this year alone explicitly for this video. I want to give a massive thank you and shout out to my channel member Alex Buffmack for helping me get through these games. I had to replay a few games, and Alex came over quite a few times despite his busy life to witness these games firsthand, and to ease the tedium of me having to replay some of them. Any bit of multiplayer footage is with and thanks to him. I don't know if I could have gotten through Resident Evil 5 solo again without mentally breaking. And here's a quick list of other games he helped me record. From the bottom of my heart, thanks man, I appreciate you. And to all of you other viewers, thank you too, especially for watching all of this behemoth. This has been a long time coming and I don't feel like stopping anytime soon. Although I don't plan on playing any survival horror until the end of February with Resident Evil Requiem, I still have more to say about a couple games that I played this year. Despite the burnout that survival horror caused me, Tormented Souls and Crow Country stood high in my mind, and I feel the need to share my experience with y'all. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you want to support the channel, don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and maybe even share it. I have memberships enabled, and obviously there's no pressure. It's a small monthly optional payment that you can use to support the channel. If it's something you choose to do, you can get your name in the credits like that Alex guy I just mentioned. But yeah, that's my whole spiel on survival horror. I hope you try out some of these games, but don't burn out like I did. Until next time, later days.